You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
Rockeymoore. I'm pleased to be joined today by my sometimes host and guest, Ernie Powell of Ernie Powell's Grassroots Corner. Welcome, Ernie.
It's absolutely great to be here with you, Maya. Thank you.
Well, there was a lot of action happening on Capitol Hill this week. A number of budgets were considered, and there were some very exciting votes in the Senate. What was your take on the action?
Well, there were a couple of votes, actually. The amendments offered by Sanders, Harkin, and Hiron on the amendment against the chain CPI, and then the Stabenow amendment, also on the Senate side, against voucherizing Medicare.
Right.
That was really good news. The other piece of good news is that our president and CEO, Max Richmond, did a very compelling piece in Huffington Post on the terrible downsides of the chain CPI, and that got a lot of coverage. That got a lot of coverage.
Yeah, well, we will be talking to Richard Eskow later on in the show to talk about what happened on the Senate side and what the various votes meant, the amendments meant for the future of Social Security and Medicare. So I think that you're absolutely right. It was good news on the Senate side this week. On the House side, however, there was some interesting votes taken on the Progressive Caucus budget, the Black Caucus budget, the Democratic budget, and this followed the Ryan budget.
And as we're starting to say, there he goes again.
There he goes again. That's exactly right.
Ryan is back. It's incredible to see that they lost in a big national vote for the presidential race, and yet he's coming back with either the same ideas or worse ideas.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that what's amazing to me are the guts of the Republican Party, particularly the House Republican Party. They seem to not get it, not yet.
Not at all. I mean, the American people want jobs. The American people want to protect Social Security, protect Medicare. They don't want cuts to those programs. They don't want to see them voucherized, yet he's back again.
Which actually brings us to our first guest. We are pleased to be joined by Annie Weinberg, who's the Associate Director of Progressive Congress, and Cole Strangler, a reporter at In These Times. They're going to be talking about the 84 votes. Annie, 84 votes. What was that?
Hi, Maya. Hi, Ernie. Very glad to be here. So we did get 84 votes for the back-to-work budget, which is actually the largest number of votes that we've seen on the record for the Progressive Caucus proposed budget since 2006. So we are excited to see folks going on the record for this bold set of progressive economic priorities. Obviously, we want there to be more, but it is exciting to see folks standing up for a really serious budget that actually focuses on putting America back to work and reinvesting in infrastructure instead of just endless austerity and giveaways to the wealthiest few.
Well, let's talk about that, because I actually believe that budgets represent your set of priorities, but also your vision for the future. And to the extent that the Progressive Caucus's Back to Work budget was a vision about literally putting Americans back to work and, investing in all of the things that we've seen crumbling over time, including our infrastructure. I mean, what does it say that only 84 members of the House, but of the Democratic Caucus, and I know that you said that it's the highest number, but to the extent that it represents our vision for the future, what kind of work is left for the Progressive Caucus to do to boost up those numbers in the future?
I think that's a great question. I think we definitely need to see more of our own Democratic caucus going on the record saying, this budget creates 7 million new jobs in the first year alone. This budget reinvest in our school teachers and our firefighters, in our crumbling roads and bridges. That's the stuff that we should be fighting for. And the conventional wisdom that endless austerity is just good politics, that's the only serious proposal out there, that conventional wisdom is shifting. And we need all members of the Democratic caucus to go on record and to understand that Americans don't want these cuts to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid benefits. They want us to actually reinvest in jobs. So I agree with you. I think we got to get more folks on the record standing up for these things and fighting for it.
Cole, you have written a series of very compelling articles in these times about the challenges and the opportunities or the challenges and the progress of the Progressive Caucus, if you will. There's a lot of politics here, and we're in an era in American politics where being liberal, being leftist, being, on the progressive side, being for Americans, being for work, being for anti-austerity measures, being for Social Security and Medicare is actually considered a fringe position.
Right. Well, first off, thanks so much for having me on. It's sort of this weird thing where, in Congress, the people that are defending these kinds of issues that you're talking about are considered on the fringe. But if you look at, polls, change CPI, 70% of the country is opposed to any sort of cut in Social Security. And so the Progressive Caucus is basically, if you look at the positions that they take, whether it's the budget or any number of the other kinds of legislation they have, that the war in Afghanistan, raising, putting a financial transaction tax on the table. I mean, they have the support of the majority of the American public, but of course, in Congress, that's not necessarily the case.
And in one of the articles that you wrote, you actually mentioned the public option debacle, how the Progressive Caucus could have exercised its power during the debate around the Affordable Care Act, and yet the Affordable Care Act passed without a public option, and ultimately it actually failed because of the Progressive Caucus. And you conclude that they're not yet serious. They're not, being strategic. What is the state of that? Mm-hmm.
Right. It's true. I spoke to, someone on the Hill who said that experience really damaged their credibility. And so looking ahead to this fight over change CPI, where you have the White House on board with this, you have Nancy Pelosi was on board with it a couple of days ago, said she's in favor of it. It's unclear how serious the stand is going to be taken. There's actually, you can kind of even see the divisions within the caucus, among caucus members on this issue, is that you have one letter that's being circulated, I think it was Jan Tchaikovsky, who started circulating along with Ellison and Grijalva. You have over 100 members of the Democratic caucus on board saying that they're opposed to any cuts in Social Security. There's another letter which takes a stronger line in the sand that has only 30 members of Congress on board that says that they will vote against any bill that includes those cuts. So I think that kind of shows the divisions within the caucus even on this issue.
So, Ernie, being opposed versus voting against, are we parsing the line that close nowadays?
It's what we have to do.
It's what we have to do.
We have to be against these bad ideas.
Annie, why do you think the Progressive Caucus can't seem to come together on actually being a voting bloc that will stand up against any measures, legislative measures, to cut Social Security and Medicare?
That is a great question. I think we, as a movement, need to continue doing even more to show these members that they need to go on record saying they're going to vote against these proposals that are damaging to the economy, to the American people, to their base, to the people that endorse for them and support them, that they are supported when they take a strong, firm stance in voting against and committing to vote against these terrible measures. So we've seen an outpouring of grassroots support around this budget. There were 46 different organizations that separately endorsed the budget, over 100,000 community co-sponsors that voiced their support. And that kind of thing does actually make an impact. It shows members of Congress that their courage on this and a bold stance on this is what moment called for. So we have to do more of that all the time.
Well, speaking of courage, I actually have been bowled over by the courage of Keith Ellison and Raul Grijalva. That, Keith Ellison, I think in this budget round, they realized that they had to win a communications and media war. And so they did everything that they could to be heard through the mainstream media. Cole, you mentioned that this is a tactical issue, perennial tactical issue with the Progressive Caucus. Do you see any light at the end of this tunnel?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. I mean, it's obviously hard to predict, but I think that it's definitely fair to say that the budget has been, and even historically, back when the Congress was getting organized, the budget was a way of getting it on the map. So now, I mean, when people hear about the Progressive Caucus, it's because of the budget they put out for the last 3 years. And this year, more than any other year, actually, the back-to-work budget, not because they've watered it down for any reason, but it was getting more attention, and you saw kind of more of that visibility. So that's sort of one way of getting the message out there. But ultimately, it's going to take some sort of better cohesive, coherent relationship between members of Congress and then the grassroots. I think there's this idea out there that the right, the Tea Party, is much more accountable to the grassroots. I don't know if that's the case because you can't really talk about the grassroots and talk about the Tea Party. It's funded so much by corporate interests, so we can't, the left can't model itself on that model. But there needs to be some more accountability to the base, and that's going to require just a better relationship, between the caucus and its allies. And that's something that it's hard to predict, but I guess we'll see. And I think a major test of this is going to be how the caucus is able to use its leverage on this vote. As part of the so-called grand bargain, this vote on potential cuts to Social Security. This is its chance, basically, to show that it should be taken seriously and that it actually stands for the values that it says it does.
So when you talk about a base, and every politician is thinking about their next election, we're walking into the Easter recess and then a longer recess in a couple of weeks. And the older voter will be very important, particularly when it's a lower turnout election in 2014. I guess where I'm going with this is, if we have 3 million members of the National Committee, what do you think their core message should be when they go to town halls, when they go to meet with their House members, both on the Democratic and Republican side? What is their core message, given this fight?
Sorry, could you just repeat that question again? I missed that. About whose core message? I just missed the beginning.
So we have the senior vote on the next election is very important, and of course we're with the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. We have 3 million members. Given all of this, what should be their core message as they talk to their House members during town halls, when they meet with them as constituents, et cetera, et cetera?
Right. I mean, I think the core message should be that there should be absolutely no cuts at all to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. I mean, and again, as you were talking about before, this is not a fringe position by any means. You look at polls, and 70% of American people are on board with this. It just so happens that because of Congress and the nature of the political system, you have, that this is somehow seen as a kind of uncompromising radical position to be holding in Congress today, that you're opposed to any benefit cuts whatsoever. But if you look at what people actually believe, it's a very mainstream position. So it's not so much that it reflects the fact that Congress is disconnected from the American people. But I think that the message should just be hold the line as firmly as possible. And there is a precedent for fighting off attacks to Social Security like this. As I pointed out in the feature I did for In These Times back in 2005, when President Bush, who had a Republican majority in the House and Senate, coming off his reelection, kind of emboldened, wanted to privatize Social Security. And it seemed like it was a possibility, but there was such a tremendous backlash against that even the Republicans in Congress knew that this was not a politically appropriate proposal, and they had to withdraw. So I think if you have that kind of just really bold grassroots opposition, then you can kind of stop these cuts from happening. I think that should be the strategy if I had to kind of give my own take on that.
Yeah, and Annie, we mentioned earlier, Cole mentioned this whole notion of towing the party line. And what we really have here is a situation where the Democrats themselves are divided, where you have nominally progressive leaders who have had progressive credentials in the past, like Nancy Pelosi, actually siding with the President of the United States of America in favor of cutting benefits, Social Security benefits for seniors, for vets, et cetera. I mean, anybody who gets a benefit that's issued by the government would be affected by the change CPI. What happened to Nancy Pelosi? And the second part of my question is what do progressives have to do to disassociate themselves with their leadership?
Well, I will take the opportunity to quote something that Keith Ellison said recently, which he said, "I am a supporter of the president, but that doesn't mean I'm a servant of the president, and I don't support him on this." I mean, these lines have to be clear, and we have to be unrelenting in not just our stated opposition, but actually committing to vote against any of these benefit cuts to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. They're just rolling back the fundamental progressive programs that built the middle class in this country in the 20th century, and it's a slippery slope. The change CPI idea is a benefit cut. It's going to hurt senior citizens and senior women in particular very deeply, and we have to staunchly oppose these both, in terms of calling on our progressive elected leaders to do it, and as a movement saying this is a line in the sand. This is not a compromisable thing. It's a core fight.
But Cole, we know that Democrats traditionally toe the party line, more or less, and I think that progressives, perhaps, more so than others, certainly than the Blue Dogs that used to regularly cross party lines in order to vote with Republicans. Mm-hmm. So, Cole, what does the Progressive Caucus have to do in order to, and I do love that line by Keith Ellison. I think that he is one of the champions out here who is able to walk that line and understand how to take a stand when it counts. But how do you actually bring the rest of the caucus along?
Yeah, I couldn't comment on how, the specifics of trying to organize votes ahead of, organizing specifics around getting people to vote in a certain way. But I think what it comes down to is basically on fights like this, voting more cohesively as a bloc. And, that's something that they haven't done necessarily that successfully in the past. But I think it comes down to basically, trying to get members on board to hold the line and to make specific stands on these kinds of issues. That's to me, I think that's the most clear way you can show that that the caucus is unified and actually stands for something is by having a record of voting consistently. So that's what it's going to come down to, I think.
Yeah. Ernie, and I was involved in the wars, the privatization wars of 2005, and literally I was all across the country talking to, seniors, to young people, to college students, you name it, about Social Security. There was a true unified movement. I think that what we're seeing here now, because we actually have a Democratic presidency and the Democrats control the Senate, I think that progressives and Democrats in general are like deer in a headlight. They seem to be unable to figure out how to actually move the political sphere and organize in a way that will beat back this threat. And it's because of the party complication, the issue of partisanship in Washington. Do you have any ideas?
Well, I think it has to be seat by seat. I was with Max a few weeks ago, Max Richmond, our CEO and president at the National Committee, and we're sort of thinking out loud about how to fight this thing. And one thing he said to me, and it just hit me it hit me hard. He said, can you imagine being a House member or being a senator and standing up in front of 200 seniors saying and answering the question about whether or not their COLA got cut based on a vote that member took? There's an emotional feeling about the cost of living adjustment. I've been in the senior movement for a number of years. I've taken hundreds of phone calls about why didn't I get my COLA this year? Why didn't I get my 1%, 2%, 3%? Mm-hmm. Yet my Medicare premiums went up. Yeah. You get those kind of questions, and it's deeply rooted, and people have earned it, and they deserve it. And the point being that I think it's a slippery slope politically. I think that the Democrats could lose the Senate over this. Mm-hmm. I think there's some seats. Any Democrat that won in 2012 with 53% or more mm-hmm. could lose their seat in 2014 because if this fires up as an issue, and I think it can, and we have to fire it up as an issue in order to get people to stand in front of their congressional members and their U.S. senators and say, don't do this. Social Security hasn't got a thing to do with a deficit. Mm-hmm. There's other things you could do. Do not cut what I need to stay out of poverty.
Right.
So I guess the best way to answer that, Maya, and it's a good question, is House seat by House seat, Senate seat by Senate seat, constituents being organized and firm and knowing the issues and being very, very strong on saying, do not do this.
Annie and Cole, thank you so much for being on the show today. Can we have you on in the future?
Of course. Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. You are listening to Pivot Point with Maya Rockeymoore, sponsored by the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. We'll be right back after the break.
This is John Bauman. You know me best as Bowser, formerly of the group Sha Na Na. And you know, when we were rocking and rolling all those years ago, I wasn't particularly worrying about my retirement or how I'd pay for health care. But now that I'm 65, I really understand the importance of Medicare. Not just for myself, but for generations of working Americans who need secure health care as they get older. That's why this election is so important. The Romney-Ryan Coupon Care Plan will mean the end of traditional Medicare. It gives seniors a partial payment which loses value over time and raises our health care costs as much as $500 more each month. Coupon Care also puts us at the mercy of private insurers, making it harder to pick our own doctors. All of this to pay for tax cuts for the wealthy? Are you kidding me? Americans of all ages say no to Coupon Care. Bum 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 dang a dang dang ding a dong ding. Preserve Medicare.
Doing it, but I've met my quota.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
Yeah, that'd be great. Welcome back to Pivot Point. I'm your host, Maya Rockeymoore, and I'm pleased to be joined by my co-host today, Ernie Powell of Ernie Powell's Grassroots Corner. Welcome again, Ernie.
So good to be here. Thank you.
We are, there was a new report that came out this week that said, lo and behold, drum roll please, the Washington Post is biased.
Heavens no.
Heavens no.
Heavens no.
Who would have thunk? My goodness, Zachary.
It's where I get all my Social Security information.
Get none of your Social Security information from the Washington Post. Zachary Pleat, Media Matters for America.
As Casey Stengel would say, it's where I look it up.
Yeah, right. Zachary, are you on with us?
Yes, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. I understand that you have a new report concerning the Washington Post's reporting. Can you tell us about what you found?
Sure. So we did a search of Washington Post editorials for the past several years and found that they had 75 editorials where they mentioned Social Security, and they had a ratio of more than 6-to-1 editorials where they mentioned benefit cuts more than increasing revenue to shore up the financial health of the program.
Well, to me, this is actually not a surprise. I guess it was about 2.5 years ago or so, I actually went to an editorial board meeting with the, what is his name? The head of the editorial board, and Ruth Marcus. And he actually told us that the official position of the editorial board is that they're interested in slowing the growth of entitlements. So that is actually their take on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera. They are interested in slowing the growth of entitlements. So it's not surprising to me that the reporting in your report actually found that out. And so my question for you is, what is the implication in terms of media balance? This is one of the nation's leading newspapers. They're supposed to, the editorial board is not supposed to be impartial, but it'd be interesting to me to know, have you all at all looked at the hard news reporting and seen a bias in that as well?
We have not taken a systematic look at that yet.
Yep. So, Ernie, it is incredible. There was a time a couple of years ago, not so long ago, when the Washington Post was considering a media partnership with a Pete Peterson-funded operation that was supposed to be, I think it was called the Fiscal Times, and they were actually going to run content from the Fiscal Times in their newspapers. And what do we know about Pete Peterson?
We know that Pete Peterson is a very wealthy, very conservative, very determined adversary, if you will, of these benefit programs. Mm-hmm. He won't say it that way, but where he puts his money and where his messages either directly or indirectly land is that the fiscal problems in this country are related to Social Security and Medicare. And he's wrong. Mm-hmm. And he's wrong because you talk about the Washington Post wants to cut the growth of these,
slow the growth is what
growth.
he said. And let me get his name because go ahead.
But the best part about this is that we already have slowed the growth. We slowed the growth in 1983 by good amendments to Social Security, which extended its solvency under some equations all the way to 2040.
Well, they weren't all so good, right? So they cut benefits for young people. I was born in 1971, and my retirement age for full normal retirement is now 67. People don't realize that the age of retirement under Social Security has already gone up, and it represents a benefit cut for those who actually who fall under that.
Right, and that was my case too, because I'm a baby boomer, and my full retirement I think is 67 as well. But that was what was needed then, and it was a pretty bipartisan consensus. Robert Dole said he was part of the committee that did it. Bob Dole said it was his finest Senate hour, and the same thing happened with Medicare with the Affordable Care Act, where fiscal moves were made within Medicare to extend its solvency life all the way to another, probably in the range of 10 years. So their statement is an irrelevant statement, in fact, and factually wrong, and absolutely the wrong direction to go. These programs are in good shape, and any kinds of changes that ought to happen ought to be around the soundness of the benefit, not cutting benefits that seniors and persons with disabilities need.
Zachary, I'm curious, were there any conclusions that you all reached about why the Washington Post editorial page seems to have this bias?
No, we didn't determine why they did it, but the problem with their slant is that benefit cuts such as change CPI were determined by the Congressional Budget Office in a report a couple years ago to only extend the trust fund by 4 years. It just doesn't do much.
And what's so interesting about it is, and when we were in that meeting a couple of years ago, we actually talked about scrapping the cap. You know, most folks don't know because most folks aren't high-wage earners. That wealthy people only pay Social Security payroll taxes on their first $113,600 in salary, and so anything above that, they're not paying Social Security payroll taxes on. But if you just scrap the cap alone, that actually eliminates the long-term solvency gap under Social Security. And yet you never hear the Washington Post actually talking about that. So, it's very interesting how the mainstream media has been co-opted, Ernie, by this Peterson kind of message of, cutting quote-unquote entitlements, which are, by the way, earned benefits. And for me, it's really kind of stealing from the American people because this is their money that they put aside for this purpose.
I agree with that completely. They've earned it, they depend on it, and it's an absolutely wrong direction to go.
Zachary, is there anything else you want to tell us about Media Matters? What's your website?
Sure. The website is MediaMatters.org, and we're a progressive media monitoring group that corrects and analyzes conservative misinformation in the media.
And how are people to use your results? What you find? I mean, how are they supposed to use that?
It can be used by pundits on TV to rebut against conservative talking points, or ordinary people can also use it to push back on social media or in discussions with friends and family.
Well, thank you very much, Zachary Pleat, for joining us today. Hope to have you on again in the future.
Thanks. Have a good day.
All right, that was Zachary Pleat of Media Matters for America on their new report concerning the Washington Post's reporting, which is not surprising, is biased, is slanted. Is the New York Times better, Ernie?
For my taste, they are. Well, first of all, they got Krugman. They've got other good writers in there, and they seem to be much more balanced.
I actually agree with that. They're more balanced, although, certainly I think on the editorial pages, they're absolutely stellar. Some of the hard news pieces, sometimes don't get it all right, but who does?
I saw some really good pieces last week on predatory lending and a number of other good issues that I think progressives agree with and that talk about the right reforms.
Right. Well, there was also a report issued by the Roosevelt Campus Institute recently, and for those who don't know, we will be talking to Alan Smith, who's the Director of Policy and Programming, and Elizabeth Stokes, who's a Senior Fellow at the Roosevelt Institute right after the break. But it's always great for me to know that young people are actually concerned about the direction of our country and have ideas about how to make this place make this country better and our institutions better.
And to add to that, particularly with the Roosevelt Foundation, concerns about Social Security and Medicare.
Absolutely.
Without these sort of instant appraisals that they're all going broke and that they're a bad thing to do and that sort of thing.
That's right.
I mean, this is a very thoughtful group, a very progressive group. So it's an exciting opportunity.
You are listening to Pivot Point with Maya Rockeymoore, sponsored by the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. Stay with us.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
Social Security and Medicare. These programs touch the lives of virtually every American family. Yet with so much misinformation out there, Americans are pretty confused about their future. You deserve the truth. For more than 30 years, the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare has been leading the fight to preserve our nation's most successful programs. Join us and find out how to keep Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid strong for all generations. Learn more online at thetruthnow.org.
This is John Bauman. You know me best as Bowser, formerly of the group Sha Na Na. But these days, I'm rocking and rolling nationwide as part of the Truth Tour with the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. Some politicians claim they want to protect Medicare, but the truth is they support the Romney-Ryan Coupon Care Plan, which would end traditional Medicare. This could raise our health care costs as much as $500 more each month. Ending Medicare doesn't protect it. Learn the facts and join our national campaign at thetruthnow.org.
Welcome back to Pivot Point. I'm your host, Maya Rockeymoore. I'm joined by Ernie Powell. Always a pleasure to be with you, Ernie.
Thank you.
The Roosevelt Campus Network released a report this week, and as I mentioned earlier, I don't know if people know, my listening audience knows, but my book, my first book, and I've got my second book coming up, was the Political Action Handbook, a how-to guide for the hip-hop generation. And I'm always concerned and interested in young people being involved in our government because, our government is about the people and everybody should feel like they have a piece of this action. Yet the way that government is structured is not designed for young people's voices to really be heard or for them to be engaged in a substantive way. I mean, there's really, when you think about it, it's amazing when you actually get a member of Congress who's like in their 20s.
Right.
Who's the voice for young people?
Well, it's a tough question, and
They don't have an AARP.
They don't have an AARP. They don't, and it's sort of a circular logic that defeats itself. In other words, voter turnout for younger people was lower, so they get less attention, which means that lower turnout's going to be lower.
But that wasn't the case in 2008 and wasn't the case in 2012.
No.
That young voters came out in big numbers and they really showed that they have power and they're paying attention. What's interesting is that the Roosevelt Campus Network actually released this report, and I understand from my producers that they're actually not on the phone today, but I hope to get them back on in the future. But they released a report that identified 4 core pillars of what government should be. They said that government should be a steward of the common good. I really believe that. And they define the common good as things that support social security and economic security, which means that, the things that we talk about all the time are core. And most people are surprised surprised by that because young people are not supposed to believe in these kind of social insurance programs.
Absolutely. That's the common welfare,
Right, the common good, they're common good. Our air that we breathe, the water that we have, these are things that we all own and the government should be a good steward of. The second pillar is government as a lawmaker, meaning that they should be better lawmakers and to the extent that, there are more ways to hear from the people and actually deliberate on good public policy. I think many Americans would be amazed to know how policy actually gets made.
The old quote about sausage.
How sausage gets made. And it's not a big deliberative process where, you consider all of the angles and then come up with the best option.
But with these ideas and with the ideas you're talking about, that the Roosevelt Institute is talking about, the key to it is citizen engagement.
That's right.
Always voting, always being there, always keeping your political representatives
which is actually
accountable.
Their third pillar, which is government as it engages citizens. And
Right.
they actually call for a new way to engage and multiple ways to engage. People out in America, particularly, they call for universal voter registration. They call for things such as online voting. They really kind of break down the walls of the citizen engagement piece.
For a country that prides itself so much in its democratic traditions, it is bizarre that there are so many encumbrances to actually voting.
Yeah, and their last pillar is government as innovator, meaning that the government has a role in uplifting the best ideas and investing in good ideas so that we can actually, benefit from innovation in this country. So, I understand our next guest is actually a friend and colleague of yours, Webster Phillips. He is at the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare, an organization that sponsors the show and that recently released a report on Social Security and gay marriage. There's been a lot going on in terms of basically, I would say, a sea change out there with regards to attitudes and beliefs about gay marriage.
More states are voting it into law. There's, of course, the Supreme Court case that comes up this week here in Washington, and this great report that the National Committee put together that I think Webb was very much a part of.
Webb, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Webb, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, you're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon.
So what are the challenges with, tell us what currently exists. Are same-sex couples able to achieve or get Social Security?
And not in the same way that individuals who are married under most state laws today. If you are a heterosexual couple and are married, there are types of benefits that you can receive that strengthens your likelihood of financial security in retirement. Being able to receive a benefit on a spouse's record as a widow or a widower, your children being able to qualify if the worker, mother or father, becomes disabled, dies, or retires. These are all protections that are provided by Social Security, but a lot of them are missing for families of our gay and lesbian citizens.
But so as Ernie mentioned earlier, there are a number of states that are actually legalizing gay marriage. So in the states where it's legal, can't those same-sex couples access Social Security? Is it a state question or is it a federal question?
I guess it's a bit of both. Overarching all of the regular state laws that would control marriage and family relationships is the Defense of Marriage Act, which Congress passed back in the 1990s, which essentially seeks to define for all federal programs the definition of marriage as being a relationship that exists between one man and one woman. And that's part of that's one of the barriers, but embedded off into certain parts of the statute, including the Social Security Act, are provisions which themselves might also get in the way unless they too are amended or set aside by the Supreme Court.
Like what?
Well, for example, when the Social Security Act defines a wife's benefit, that's the term they use, it describes a woman who can get benefits on her husband. and it does this by the use of the pronouns that creates the sexual relationship that everybody has in mind when they think of marriage. Certainly back in the 1950s and 60s when these provisions were last significantly altered. A widower is a male beneficiary who can qualify on his wife. A widow is a female beneficiary who can qualify on her husband. So those kinds of pronouns in the Social Security Act would probably also get in the way, unless, of course, the Supreme Court rules very broadly and strikes all that down, which they have done in the past.
What do you think the chances of that are, Ernie? They don't seem to be very liberal at the Supreme Court.
I was listening to a talk show this morning, a political talk show, and they were going, I mean, every pundit was saying different things. I can't call that.
You can't call
I'm
it.
hopeful. I'm
I
hopeful.
actually can't call it either.
Yeah.
But it seems like, they're, testing the wind, and, a lot of politicians are shifting. I think that we saw just 2 weeks ago.
I mean, if they say they believe in limited government, this is government intruding on people's personal choices and lives.
Mm-hmm.
A conservative court ought to agree with those principles. We'll see.
Webb, what do you think?
Well, I think back of Lawrence v. Texas, which was a Supreme Court decision in, I believe, 2003 that struck down state laws that made a sexual relationship between consenting adults that were from the same sex illegal. Mm-hmm. Essentially, the same court today, in terms of liberal-conservative divide, was there then and acted that way and wrote a decision of that nature. So I don't know. It's anybody's guess. But certainly Kennedy will be the swing judge.
He always is. Yeah. So Webster, what were the findings of the report? What do you propose?
Well, we propose that just as a matter of simple fairness, that benefits under Social Security should be available to gay and lesbian families in exactly the same way that they are made available to the families of heterosexual couples. Children should be able to qualify on both parents' records. In a lot of states, that's not possible because only one non-related adult can adopt a child, and only one member of a couple is likely to be the biological parent of the child. So there are all kinds of gaps that are created in the Social Security program by the different nature of gay and lesbian relationships, and we believe those should be fixed. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fairness.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead. As a matter of fairness, we are in a time of, as you well know, austerity, where people are talking about costs, and many people are talking about cutting Social Security. Is there any kind of fiscal implication of making this change?
Well, remarkably, not a very big one at all, although there haven't been any formal assessments of legislation of this nature by the Social Security actuaries. I've spoken to them privately, and they have suggested that this would have a negligible effect on the Social Security program. It's not to say that it won't have an effect, but it will be a very small effect.
How has this report been received by, A, your membership, which is traditionally older and perhaps more conservative in terms of some of these social issues, and B, by the mainstream public?
Well, I'm very encouraged by the response that we've gotten. Our members, I believe, are more broad-minded than some people might think. And this isn't the first time, actually, that the National Committee has taken a position on this issue. In the report we issued almost a year ago, Breaking the Glass Ceiling, a proposal to modernize Social Security benefits for women, we also advocated for equal benefits for same-sex marriage, and the response has been very positive.
And is it not true, Webb, that we are also attempting to move this on the House side through some specific legislation?
That's right. We have been working with people in the House. We've been working with folks in the Senate to identify champions who will be willing to advocate for both of these reports, the glass ceiling report for improving the program for women and for improving benefits for gays and lesbians. And I think we're starting to get some traction there. I think we'll be seeing some bills coming out soon that will reflect some of these proposals.
Well, what's the bottom line? What is this, and you worked on this report with some advocates, right, from the gay and lesbian, transgender, bisexual community?
We did. We worked with the Human Rights Campaign to develop this, and it's a joint report that was prepared by both our organizations and were authored by officials from both the National Committee Foundation and the HRC Foundation. So we work closely with them. Just as we did with the women's report last year when we worked with the National Organization for Women and with the Institute for Women's Policy Research. Mm-hmm. We think that building coalitions is really the way to get these things done, mm-hmm. and that's how we've tried to approach this.
And I know that at a staff and a grassroots level, we're looking to get other groups to join in, to see the report, to weigh in on this issue, because it's a high priority. It's a benefit that ought to be there for people.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Webb, for joining us. So we really appreciate you bringing this insight. I think that probably this is one of the issues that mainstream America hadn't thought of. And so the National Committee is, again, at the forefront of raising the critical issues and trying to advance an agenda. So thank you for your time.
Well, you're welcome.
All right, you're listening to Pivot Point with Maya Rockeymoore, sponsored by the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. We'll be right back with Richard Eskow to talk about what happened in the Senate this week on the Sanders Amendment and some of the other exciting things that happened. Stay with us.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
Is there already an existing bill?
Yeah, she wrote it. She did it.
Welcome back to Pivot Point. I am your host, Maya Rockeymoore, and I am very pleased, as always, to be joined by Ernie Powell of Ernie Powell's Grassroots Corner.
Great to be here this afternoon.
Richard Eskow, the prolific Richard Eskow, also his own radio show host, also activist extraordinaire. Richard, are you with us? He's not with us yet.
He's not with us.
But he will be soon.
Extraordinary anything before. Thank you.
We'll take that, Richard. Welcome.
You're also a senior fellow.
Well, that's just age, but thanks so much. It's always good to
You can be 20 years old and still be a senior fellow, Richard. Come on, just claim, be a millennial if you want.
Okay.
So, Richard, exciting happenings on the Senate side this week. Can you give us the rundown?
Yeah, basically there were two amendments introduced this week in the budget proceedings, both of which had to do with what they've come to call entitlements, although I'm not crazy about that particular word. One addressed Medicare and the other Social Security, and one was the Sanders-Harkin-Hirono amendment, which called on, which was basically, they're basically both non-binding, although they're attached to the budget at this point. But the Sanders-Harkin-Hirono amendment was asked the Senate to affirm that the chain CPI, the so-called chain CPI, which is a benefit cut in Social Security and also a tax increase on the middle class, should not be part of any budget deal or grand bargain, and that passed by voice vote. And then the Stabenow amendment from Senator Debbie Stabenow was a sense of the Senate to reject vouchers in Medicare, and that passed by a surprising 96 votes to 3. So both of these amendments designed to defend people who rely on Social Security or Medicare passed decisively this week.
So let's break this down. So was there a move to actually implement the chain CPI for veterans, and the Sanders Amendment actually deflected that move?
It was not a specific... This is more a sense that, and believe me, I spent a lot of time in touch with the Sanders people, that this could happen to veterans as well as to the elderly and other people on Social Security. So it was more of a preventive move, a preemptive move against the chain CPI, because we keep hearing that could be part of a budget agreement.
Okay, so this is where I get critical then. So it was a strategic move on behalf of Bernie Sanders and other progressives in the Senate to say, you know, veterans would be affected by a chain CPI, and we need to go on record as either being for or against this. And the fact of the matter is that they voted, and I say vote in quotes because they only did it by a voice vote, which means that nobody's really on record as being against it. Yet that doesn't mean that they're against the chain CPI, and as Richard just said, the chain CPI is a benefit cut. It doesn't mean that they're against it for senior citizens. It doesn't mean they're against it for all Social Security beneficiaries, including disabled and survivors. It doesn't mean that they're against it for SSI recipients, right?
Well, I asked the same question of the Sanders people and was told that, yes, it does mean that. So I think the best that can be said is that there's a lack of clarity on that topic, and that's unfortunate because we certainly would like to see the Senate on record as opposing the chain CPI for all of these benefits, for all of these recipients, and not just for veterans. So I wish there had been a little more clarity on it.
And in one of your articles, you actually mentioned that Bernie Sanders wanted to call for a roll call vote, which means that he didn't want it to just be a voice vote. He wanted people to actually go on record as being for or against it. And yet he was talked out of it, quote unquote. Why do you think that is?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, because then we're getting into the sort of a very complex inner machinery of Senate procedure, but I would assume that there was a good reason, as in it might not get introduced, or, I don't really know the answer to that. But I do know that that was his preference to have there be a roll call vote.
Are you willing to speculate, Ernie?
My speculation was that I read your piece, Richard, and my own just gut prediction here or speculation is that they wanted to protect some members that didn't want to be on the record.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I think we're both saying essentially the same thing, which is that if he stuck to it, that they were going to block its introduction. But I think you're probably right, and I think that at the end of the day, will this prevent a grand bargain? Well, no, there's no guarantee of that.
But it gives us an interesting opportunity, Maya.
Does it?
Well, here's the opportunity.
Because I'm about to push back right here. Let's go. Let's go.
I don't. First of all, I wish it had been a real vote.
Right.
With really punching the hole and seeing who voted where. Having said that, it did pass by voice vote. Now the opportunity is to get everybody we know with all these senators and say, which way did you vote, and make them answer that.
Oh,
please. That's a grassroots opportunity.
No, I actually like that idea. Let's not forget, and I know, Maya, you're going to push back in a second, but also let's not forget that Sanders got a lot of people to sign a letter opposing the change CPI. So I think, I think there's no protection right now against a grand bargain that includes this cut, but I think what we've got to do is take what we've got and build the best firewall we can with it.
Okay, so my speculation, as you all well know, the White House has put this on the table, is one of their best ideas, and I say that in quotes because it's an awful idea, for actually how to enter or engage into a grand bargain with cuts to entitlements with the Republicans. It's a lure, if you will. And I'm sure that they were on the phone trying to ensure that they maintain maximum latitude and flexibility in terms of continuing to angle for cuts to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid in the future, because they didn't want anybody to go on the record. And I would argue that probably some Democrats in the Senate leadership as well were against a voice vote for that very same reason. So, ultimately, here we are again with progressives not playing hardball, towing a party line, even though Bernie is not a part of the Democratic Party and he's an independent and nominally not beholden to anyone, but certainly falling prey to that particular crew on this particular issue. And now, at the end of the day, it may be a non-issue. It may be a non-issue, but it still keeps this thing in play, this grand bargain in play, does it not?
Well, of course it does. I mean, I think there's no question about that, and I think that the answer to that is, okay, what do we do about that? And I think the answer is we organize and we stay on it. And I think, I think we can all probably agree that the White House, among other things, actually thinks that this horrible idea is good policy. Mm-hmm. I mean, I heard that from a very, very senior, head of a very large cabinet office years ago. I mean, they believe in this. They think this is a good idea. So I think then the question is, Republicans clearly want it, and there's no way they'd rather have it than have it around the neck of the Democrats and a Democratic president. So I think the question is then, how do we stop it? And to the extent that the Sanders voice vote, while not what we would have liked to see, gives us anything to work with, I think we've got to work with that by saying this is an undemocratic idea. People voted against it. The senators weren't willing to stand up and say, I'm for it. Now you're going to try to force it down our throats by saying government will shut down or whatever crisis they invent at the moment. This is not democratic. You're not representing the people. You had a vote and turned it down. We're going to lean on you now. And I like Ernie's idea of laying the groundwork now for that.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
What's interesting about the White House position is that they say they like it, but they say they're going to exempt certain vulnerable populations from it.
Right. Well, they argue that it's a better way to calculate the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which actually determines your cost of living adjustment. And yet, if it's a better way, then why are you exempting?
That's exactly the point.
Why are you trying to exempt veterans? Why are you trying to exempt? Because it hurts people. That's why they're trying to exempt people from this.
Right. And the very notion, I actually take offense. I mean, this comes straight out of Pete Peterson's groups, by the way. He's the billionaire, as you know, who's been trying to cut Social Security for decades. But this comes straight out of his playbook, which is, but when you think about it, why are you trying to protect vulnerable populations with the Social Security benefits of the average woman who gets $890 a month at Social Security right now? Why is that where you go to supposedly protect vulnerable populations, number one? And number two, as you say, and Lawrence Michel has said at the Economic Policy Institute, that means it clearly does hurt people to do this. And by the way, number three, if you look at the way, we could get into a technical discussion, but the short answer is it's not a better way to calculate inflation for the elderly and disabled. It's a much worse way, and the way that's being used now is inadequate, understates inflation.
That's right, CPIE, which is the CPI that's actually for elderly populations. Right now it's an experimental measure, but, what does it do?
It takes. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Richard.
Well,
please.
Basically, what the CPIE does is it calculates inflation for the basket of goods that people on Social Security actually use. For example, the standard Social Security measurement uses taxes on a new car purchase, for example, which is whereas the elderly and disabled people are more likely to use public transportation. So it factors in things like public transportation, gives a greater factoring for medical care, which is something that these populations use much more of. So it's the out-of-pocket cost of medical care. So it's a much more accurate measurement that would also lead to a higher, not lower, inflation curve.
Richard, this is my last question because we are running out of time, but I don't want to give short shrift to the Stabenow vote because how many people voted for the Stabenow amendment?
Well, it was 96-3. So
was that a resounding Senate defeat for Paul Ryan?
You know, it wasn't. I should have seen this coming because what it actually was the Republicans going back to their old trick of saying it's not really a voucher. That the Ryan voucher plan, it's not really a voucher because we don't issue little certificates. So it's really, I think they were just playing with words, but it certainly suggests that idea is, they're not on record as opposing the Ryan plan, but they're certainly on record as understanding that the very idea is political poison.
Wow. Well, here we are playing games still with checks that people rely on to purchase heating, purchase food, purchase housing, purchase medical care. Instead of having a country with leaders who realize that our growing income inequality is so bad that we really need to look at using policy to level some of the inequities that have been policy-driven over the past several decades, instead of looking to get us out of this fiscal mess that we're in because of elite Wall Street players and bankers and everyone else who had a stake in this international gambling casino that actually took us over a financial cliff in 2008. Instead of leveling a financial transaction tax, we've got leaders who are actually seriously deliberating and debating cutting benefits that normal, everyday, average people need to survive, like Social Security, like Medicare, like Medicaid. And they're saying that this is the pathway to actually bring our long-term budget under control. And the fact of the matter is this is a transfer of wealth from lower-income people to the top upper 1% to 2% of Americans.
Well said.
That was a summary extraordinaire.
Well said. Perfectly said. Tax cuts that shouldn't have happened, 2 unfunded wars, an unfunded prescription drug benefit. I mean, that is the past that is still the present.
Richard, what do we have to do to break this juggernaut? And we got to let you go, but I am so just disheartened by some Democrats and definitely by Republicans who have chosen not to lead.
Well, I think the progressive movement has to do a lot of very deep soul-searching about which lines it's prepared to draw in the sand and say thus far and no further to the people that it has traditionally supported for elective office. I think the progressive movement needs to get very tough.
And with that, tough, I agree with you, Richard. Tough is the answer for the day. And I thank everybody for joining us for yet another edition of Pivot Point with Maya Rockeymoore. I'd like to thank our sponsor, the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. As always, I'd also like to thank our production team of Peter James Callahan, Rich Webster, and Courtney Walters. And Ernie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's always a pleasure to see you in person. So thank you for joining me today. And I would like to remind our listening audience to join us every Sunday live at 3 p.m. Eastern Time on weactradio.com or 1480 a.m. if you're in the Washington, D.C. area. Until next time, America.
The way you pause, it sounds like there's another sentence.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.